In the shadows of dynasties and thrones, alliances were not always built on love, but on strategy, betrayal, and sacrifice. The Foreign Queen, A King's Price of Blood, uncovers the haunting tale of how marriage, politics, and power demanded a price no crown could ever repay. Political marriage for power was one of the most enduring practices across the medieval and early modern world, shaping kingdoms, empires, and dynasties in ways that warfare alone could not. While conquest could seize land and treasure, and armies could enforce authority, it was marriage that often ensured stability, legitimacy, and the binding of rival powers into one bloodline. For kings and queens, love was rarely the purpose of a union. Instead, the crown demanded strategic calculation, and a bride or groom was rarely chosen for personal affection, but rather for the value of their lineage, dowry, or the alliances their family could secure. A marriage was a weapon in the game of dynastic chess, one move that could secure peace, expand territory, or ensure that a fragile throne would not be overturned by foreign or domestic rivals. To marry politically was to accept that a spouse was not simply a partner, but a treaty embodied in flesh and blood, a human symbol of the alliance between two powers who might otherwise have been enemies. When a king looked beyond his borders for a bride, the decision was never his alone. Councils, advisors, clerics, and diplomats weighed the possibilities, studying maps of Europe, the Middle East, and beyond, calculating which bride could bring the most advantage. A dowry might mean access to lands or ports that were otherwise contested. A marriage might bring an end to a costly war, merging bloodlines that had shed one another's blood for decades. For ambitious rulers, it was often better to win a princess through negotiation than through siege, for a conquered people might rebel, but a marriage alliance could turn them into subjects loyal to the new shared dynasty. Yet even as these marriages offered promises of peace and prosperity, they demanded sacrifices that were deeply personal, often cruel, and sometimes deadly. The foreign queen, brought into an alien land, was expected to embody loyalty, to abandon her native customs, and to bear heirs who would ensure the continuation of her husband's line. Throughout history, there are countless examples of political marriages wielded as tools of statecraft. The Habsburg dynasty of Europe became legendary for their strategy of expanding power not through endless war, but through carefully arranged unions. The saying went that while other rulers waged battles, the Habsburgs waged marriages. By marrying into the thrones of Spain, Hungary, Bohemia, and the Low Countries, they created an empire so vast that it was said the sun never set upon it. These marriages, however, were not romantic tales but cold calculations. Young princesses were sent across continents, often as children, to marry men they had never seen, to speak languages they had never learned, to rule over peoples who resented their foreign blood. Their role was to cement the empire's reach, their bodies turned into vessels for dynastic ambition. The idea of political marriage was not confined to Europe. Across the medieval Islamic world, rulers also used marriage as a means of legitimizing power and forging alliances. Caliphs, sultans, and emirs arranged unions with the daughters of tribal leaders or rival dynasties, using these bonds to secure loyalty or prevent uprisings. In East Asia, Chinese emperors often received princesses as brides from states on their borders, though these unions were not always equal exchanges but displays of imperial dominance. For smaller kingdoms, offering a daughter to the Chinese court was a way to preserve autonomy in the face of overwhelming power, a recognition that survival sometimes required sacrifice. In every region, the lesson was the same: marriage was a tool to weave fragile threads of peace. But it was also a reminder that no family, no dynasty, and no throne was beyond the reach of blood politics. For the individuals bound in these unions, the personal cost was immense. A young bride might be sent hundreds of miles away, never to see her homeland again. She would be expected to adopt her husband's faith, customs, and loyalties, even when they contradicted her upbringing. Her identity became that of her new kingdom, and any sign of divided loyalty could mark her as a traitor. The foreign queen was both honored and distrusted. She embodied a treaty, but also carried the dangerous weight of being the outsider. Courtiers might whisper that her loyalties lay with her father's kingdom, not her husband's. If wars reignited between the two states, she could be accused of spying, of poisoning the king's mind, of plotting to deliver the crown to her blood relatives. In such an environment, she walked a perilous path, knowing that her survival depended on her ability to produce heirs, to win favor at court, and to navigate the treacherous politics of being both an insider and outsider at once. The king, too, bore his share of burdens, though his were shaped less by exile and more by compromise. A political marriage might force him to take a bride who was not of his choosing, whose personality and presence he may not admire, and whose family connections might bring obligations he did not welcome. A dowry might come with expectations of military support in wars he wished to avoid. A marriage might bind him to peace when his nobles hungered for conquest. The king's personal desires mattered little when compared with the broader demands of dynastic survival. His duty was to secure heirs and to maintain the fragile balance of alliances, even if it meant that the woman he married was seen more as a political hostage than a beloved companion. The practice of betrothing children for such unions reveals just how transactional these arrangements were. It was not uncommon for royal children to be promised to one another before they had reached adolescence. A girl of 12 might be sent to marry a man twice or 3 times her age, the urgency of dynastic continuity overriding concerns of health or morality. In some cases, betrothals were made while the children were still infants, mere tokens in the diplomatic exchanges between kings. For the parents arranging these matches, their children's bodies were pieces on the board of power. The bonds of family affection were subordinated to the demands of throne and empire. Political marriages often reshaped maps, and entire regions felt their consequences. The marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile united 2 powerful Spanish kingdoms, paving the way for the creation of a unified Spain and the beginning of its global empire. The union of Mary Tudor of England with Philip II of Spain sought to bind the English crown to the Habsburgs, though it was deeply unpopular with the English people, who feared domination by a foreign monarch. In Scotland, the marriages of Mary, Queen of Scots, placed her at the centre of international intrigue, as her unions with French and later Scottish nobles became entangled with religious conflict and foreign alliances. Each marriage was not simply a private vow, but a public act with consequences that reached far beyond the bedroom and the nursery. At times, political marriages were meant to heal old wounds. When 2 kingdoms had fought bitter wars, a marriage between their royal houses was presented as a guarantee that peace would hold. The idea was simple: if the 2 crowns were united by blood, then the interests of the kingdoms would be intertwined, and conflict would become less likely. Yet peace built on marriage was fragile. If heirs did not come, or if the marriage soared, the alliance could crumble as quickly as it had been forged. Enemies reconciled through marriage often found themselves at war again within a generation, the promise of blood ties unable to outweigh the lure of conquest or the sting of betrayal. The role of the foreign queen in such unions was particularly precarious. She was often viewed as both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, she symbolized the alliance and brought the prestige of her father's house. On the other hand, she was a visible reminder of foreign influence, and any sign of misfortune in her adopted kingdom could be blamed upon her. If harvests failed, if the king fell ill, if wars broke out anew, whispers could spread that the queen was cursed, that her foreign gods or foreign blood had poisoned the realm. Accusations of witchcraft were not uncommon, and many foreign queens lived under the constant shadow of suspicion, their loyalty questioned even after years of service to their new people. These marriages also created tangled webs of inheritance that could spark future conflicts. A marriage might grant a claim to a foreign throne, and when such claims were contested, they could plunge entire regions into war. The 100 Years' War between England and France was rooted partly in dynastic claims, arising from marriage ties, as English kings asserted rights to the French crown through their maternal line. Far from preventing bloodshed, political marriages could create disputes that lasted centuries, the supposed bonds of unity becoming seeds of division and conquest. Yet, despite these risks, rulers continued to rely on marriage as one of their most trusted tools. To reject such alliances was to risk isolation, to face enemies on all sides without the shield of blood ties. In a world where legitimacy mattered as much as force, a king who ruled without strong marital connections could be seen as weak, vulnerable, or even illegitimate. His throne could be challenged by rivals with stronger claims through maternal or paternal descent. Blood was power, and marriage was the vessel through which that power was secured, extended, and preserved. The history of political marriage is, in truth, the history of sacrifice. It is the story of women torn from their homelands, of kings forced into unwanted unions, of children born not from affection but from obligation, of treaties written into the flesh of royal heirs. It is the story of how dynasties survived by binding themselves to strangers, how nations sought to end bloodshed by sealing bonds in blood, and how behind every crown there was always a price to be paid. Bloodline as currency was one of the most potent realities in the political life of kings, queens, and dynasties, a force more powerful than gold, armies, or even faith, because lineage itself could determine who had the right to rule, who could claim lands, and who would be denied legitimacy. In a world where parchment charters and royal seals could be forged, where armies could be crushed in battle, and where treasures could be spent and lost, bloodlines were far more enduring. They carried with them claims that could not be erased, rights that could not be denied without force, and connections that could transform a minor prince into a contender for an empire. Kings guarded their bloodlines with a jealousy that bordered on paranoia, because in that sacred inheritance lay the foundation of their authority. To dilute, to contaminate, or to squander it through careless unions meant jeopardizing not only one's own reign, but the survival of the dynasty itself. Blood was not simply a family matter, but the very fabric of political legitimacy. To be descended from an ancient royal line gave a ruler an aura that no amount of conquest could equal. The claim of a king was never merely that he had seized a throne, but that his bloodline placed him above all others, chosen by ancestry and ordained by continuity. Genealogists and chroniclers were employed not for curiosity, but for survival, tasked with tracing descent, documenting connections, and proving beyond doubt that the ruling house had the right to hold the crown. When two kingdoms disputed a territory, it was often not the strength of arms that determined the initial claim, but the question of whose bloodline carried the stronger right. Entire wars erupted because one monarch argued that through a grandmother or great-aunt, through some distant marriage, the crown of another realm was theirs by blood. This was the weight of lineage as currency, a form of wealth that could be inherited, traded, or stolen, but never conjured out of nothing. The use of marriage to exchange and secure bloodlines made dynastic unions more than ceremonial. When a king wed a foreign queen, he was not merely taking a spouse, but acquiring access to her blood, and therefore to the claims that her ancestry carried. If she was the daughter of a powerful monarch, her offspring could inherit those rights, uniting two claims into one person, and in that child the destiny of entire realms could be reshaped. A bride's dowry was important, but it was often the blood she brought with her that mattered more. Even if her father did not surrender lands immediately, the union meant that her son could one day assert a claim to them, turning peaceful inheritance into conquest without swords drawn. Thus, the womb of the queen became the vault in which future power was stored, her ability to give birth not only determining her personal security at court, but shaping the entire future of her husband's dynasty. In this sense, royal children were more than heirs. They were the living embodiment of treaties, the proof of alliances, and the promise of future claims. Princes and princesses were raised with the knowledge that their blood made them valuable in ways that extended beyond personal worth. A child born of two great houses was a jewel, a token that could be offered in marriage to create yet another bond, or a weapon to be wielded in the dangerous game of succession disputes. Rival dynasties watched such births with suspicion and dread, knowing that a single infant could unite two thrones and overshadow their own claims. This is why baptisms and christenings were not private ceremonies, but public spectacles, carefully documented, attended by ambassadors, and reported in every court across the continent. The announcement of a royal birth was not merely the celebration of life, but the proclamation of political currency entering circulation. Bloodlines, however, were fragile. Disease, war, and infertility could erase generations of careful planning in a single moment. Dynasties sometimes found themselves reduced to a single heir, and that heir became the most valuable commodity in all of Europe. Kings and queens with only one child faced both the promise of continuity and the terror of extinction. Every illness was watched with dread, every accident feared, because the loss of that blood would mean the collapse of a dynasty. In such times, marriages were negotiated with desperation, as rulers sought to ensure that the single thread of their lineage could be woven into another house strong enough to preserve it. This desperation often led to reckless unions, rushed betrothals, or marriages that ignored cultural, religious, or political tensions, simply because the preservation of the bloodline mattered more than stability or peace. The fixation on pure bloodlines also gave rise to practices that to modern eyes appear cruel or even grotesque. Intermarriage between close relatives became common in ruling houses as dynasties sought to preserve their claims and keep their blood from dispersing into rival families. The Habsburgs were notorious for this, producing generations of rulers whose physical deformities and illnesses were the direct result of repeated intermarriage between cousins and uncles and nieces. Yet for the rulers of the time, these sacrifices of health and vitality were accepted risks, outweighed by the belief that only by keeping bloodlines tightly bound could their claims remain unchallenged. The tragic irony was that the very obsession with bloodlines as currency sometimes destroyed the dynasties it sought to protect, leaving them weak, infertile, or incapable of producing heirs at all. The use of bloodline as currency also extended beyond the living to the dead. Ancestors became tools in arguments, their marriages and births cited centuries later as justification for claims. Kings invoked their great-grandmothers and distant cousins, as though they were coins still in circulation, their bloodlines never truly expiring in value. When disputes arose, genealogists were summoned to trace complex webs of descent, to demonstrate that even a tenuous link could legitimize a crown. In courts across Europe, debates over family trees were as serious as any battlefield, and victories in such arguments could bring as much land and wealth as victories in war. The past itself became a treasury, with each generation's unions adding new riches of legitimacy that could be spent when needed for queens. The weight of this system was suffocating. Their value was not measured in wisdom, charm, or even wealth, but in their ability to carry bloodlines forward. A barren queen was not only a personal disappointment to her husband, but a political disaster for the dynasty. Failure to produce heirs could result in annulments, exiles, or worse, as the need for bloodline survival outweighed loyalty to the woman herself. Queens who bore only daughters were often pitied or scorned, their efforts dismissed because male heirs were seen as the only true continuation of the line. The anxiety of succession haunted every royal marriage, making childbirth not a private family event, but a national concern, watched with scrutiny and burdened with expectation. Even in moments of triumph, when a healthy son was born, the queen's role was not celebrated for her sacrifice, but measured only in terms of the currency she had successfully delivered. The obsession with bloodlines reached into matters of faith and politics as well. Religious authorities often endorsed or condemned marriages based on whether the resulting bloodlines would serve the church's interests. Popes wielded enormous power by granting or denying dispensations for unions between close relatives, their decisions shaping dynasties and altering the fate of nations. A dispensation was not only a spiritual judgment, but a recognition of bloodline value, a license that permitted the dangerous, but politically advantageous practice of intermarriage. In this way, even the church became a banker in the economy of blood, issuing approvals and denials that determined how dynastic currency could be exchanged. The value of bloodlines also created vulnerability. Pretenders and impostors emerged, claiming descent from royal houses in order to challenge thrones. If blood alone could grant legitimacy, then to fabricate or exaggerate one's ancestry was a path to power. Throughout history, courts were plagued by such figures, men and women who insisted that they were lost princes or hidden heirs, their very existence a threat, because the possibility could not be entirely disproven. The fear of such claims haunted monarchs, who knew that their blood, carefully guarded and proudly displayed, could also be their downfall if rival lines asserted a stronger or older right. In this sense, blood was not only currency but a weapon, one that could be wielded against its owners by those bold enough to seize its value. Dynasties that understood this currency wielded it with great skill. The Capetians of France expanded their influence by ensuring that cadet branches of their bloodline filled the thrones of neighboring regions, extending their reach without conquest. The Plantagenets of England built a legacy of claims to French lands through their maternal connections, turning marriages made generations earlier into justifications for war. The Ottomans, though less bound by the strict European concept of lineage, nonetheless recognized the symbolic power of blood by marrying into noble families of conquered regions, transforming former rivals into legitimizers of imperial authority. Across cultures, the principle remained the same: blood carried value, and to invest in it wisely was to ensure the survival of the state. This system made the personal lives of rulers inseparable from the fate of nations. Every marriage bed was a political stage, every birth a transaction, every child a coin struck in the mint of dynastic ambition. Families were torn apart, not by quarrels or affection, but by the demand that their blood serve the crown. Brothers were married off to rival houses, sisters sent abroad never to return, cousins turned into enemies when their claims overlapped. The dynasty was less a family than a bank, with blood as its currency and every member a deposit or withdrawal in the greater account of power. Even when bloodlines achieved their intended goal, uniting crowns and stabilizing realms, the consequences were not always peaceful. The very success of these unions often created empires too vast to govern, heirs with claims too numerous to satisfy, and rivalries within families that were fiercer than those between nations. Brothers fought brothers for inheritance, uncles challenged nephews, cousins plotted against cousins, all believing that their share of the blood entitled them to the throne. Blood as currency enriched dynasties, but it also bankrupted them in conflict, as the value of lineage could never be equally divided among all who bore it. In the end, bloodline as currency was both a blessing and a curse, a treasure that brought crowns to heads, but also swords to throats, a wealth that could not be hoarded without risk, a fortune that demanded constant investment through marriage, childbirth, and inheritance, and for rulers who lived under its shadow, there was no escape from the knowledge that their veins carried both the promise of power and the burden of its endless cost. Betrayal within the court was one of the most constant and corrosive features of royal power. For behind the walls of palaces and castles, beneath the glitter of ceremony and the whisper of silks, lay a labyrinth of suspicion, rivalry, and ambition where no bond was entirely secure and no oath beyond breaking. To be at court was to be close to the king or queen, but proximity to power carried with it both privilege and danger. For those who served the crown were also those most capable of undermining it. Treachery did not always come in the form of open rebellion. It was more often subtle, hidden in half-spoken words, forged documents, poisoned cups, or whispered rumors that could destroy a reputation before a single sword was drawn. Every throne was surrounded by faces that smiled in public while plotting in private, and every ruler knew that the most dangerous enemies were often not across the border, but standing at their side. The structure of courts themselves made betrayal almost inevitable. Monarchs depended on advisors, courtiers, and nobles to govern their realms, for no king could rule alone. Yet the very men and women entrusted with carrying out royal commands were also those with ambitions of their own. To be near the sovereign meant access to wealth, favors, and influence, but also the constant temptation to grasp more than was given. Positions were bought and sold with loyalty, but loyalty was fragile, shifting with the tides of fortune. A noble who felt slighted, a minister passed over for promotion, a courtier denied a marriage alliance could turn from loyal servant to bitter enemy. In such an atmosphere, betrayal was not a matter of if but when, and monarchs lived under the perpetual shadow of treason lurking in their closest circles. The foreign queen, arriving as both bride and symbol of alliance, was particularly vulnerable to betrayal within the court. As an outsider, she carried suspicions of divided loyalty, her every word and gesture scrutinized for signs that she favored her homeland over her new realm. Courtiers could exploit this suspicion to undermine her, whispering to the king that his queen was plotting with foreign ambassadors, that she passed secrets in coded letters, that her loyalties were compromised by blood. Whether true or false, such rumors could be devastating, isolating her from allies and leaving her exposed to rivals who sought to seize her influence. Even her ladies, In waiting, appointed to serve her, might be spies placed by factions within the court, reporting her every move to others eager to weaken her position. Betrayal in this context was not an extraordinary act, but a daily hazard of survival. Woven into the very fabric of palace life, kings themselves were often betrayed by those they trusted most. Ministers, generals, and counselors who owed their positions to royal favor sometimes turned against their master when the opportunity for greater gain arose. Some plotted with foreign powers, offering intelligence or promises of support in exchange for wealth or titles. Others conspired with discontented nobles at home, seeking to replace the king with a more pliable figure. In times of crisis, when wars went poorly or finances crumbled, betrayals multiplied, as courtiers sought to distance themselves from a failing monarch and align with whichever faction seemed destined to rise. Loyalty was a coin, and in the treacherous world of court politics, it was spent sparingly and hoarded selfishly, rarely offered without expectation of return. The weapon of betrayal was often information, for knowledge at court was as deadly as any sword. A misplaced word, a letter intercepted, a rumor spread in the right ear at the right time could topple ministers, destroy marriages, and even bring down monarchs. Spies were everywhere, not only among servants and guards, but within the nobility itself, for ambitious families maintained networks of informants to watch rivals and report every misstep. Secrets about a noble's debts, a queen's supposed indiscretions, a prince's illegitimate children could be traded like currency, each one a dagger concealed in velvet. The most skilled courtiers did not need armies to destroy their enemies. They needed only patience, subtlety, and the art of betrayal delivered in whispers. Poison was another tool of treachery, feared throughout courts from Europe to Asia, for it could strike silently and without warning. A chalice of wine at a banquet, a dish prepared in the royal kitchens, a simple gift of perfume or ointment could become the instrument of betrayal. Monarchs lived in constant fear of such hidden dangers, employing tasters, apothecaries, and alchemists to guard against invisible threats. Yet even with precautions, many fell victim to the betrayal of poison, their deaths cloaked in mystery, leaving historians to wonder whether illness or treachery carried them away. What made poison so terrifying was not only its lethality, but its intimacy, for it could only be delivered by those close enough to touch the monarch's food, to dress the queen, to attend the king's chambers. It was betrayal distilled into its purest form, the turning of service into murder. Yet betrayal did not always aim at the monarch directly. More often, it unfolded through shifting alliances among nobles and courtiers, each faction maneuvering to outwit the other. Marriages were arranged to bind allies, while betrothals were broken to spite rivals. Bribes were exchanged for votes in councils, offices were sold in secret. Promises were made and broken with little regard for honor. Betrayal became the currency of ambition, a language understood by all who sought advancement. To survive at court required both the ability to betray and the ability to endure betrayal, for trust was never absolute, and even the closest friendships could dissolve into rivalry under the pressure of power. In such an environment, betrayal was not a shameful exception, but an expected strategy, a tool sharpened by necessity and wielded without hesitation. The presence of foreign ambassadors and envoys intensified the atmosphere of treachery. Every court was a marketplace of secrets, where diplomats sought to buy information, to bribe servants, and to recruit discontented nobles as informants. Betrayal became an international business, conducted in the shadows of great halls and in the backrooms of palaces. Monarchs were often surrounded not only by their own courtiers, but by the invisible hands of foreign powers, pulling strings through bribery and persuasion. A disloyal minister might be in the pay of 2 or 3 foreign crowns at once, betraying his own sovereign for the promise of wealth or influence abroad. The court was less a sanctuary of loyalty than a stage upon which every actor played multiple roles, and betrayal was the script that guided their performance. Religious divisions added another layer of danger. In times of reformation, schism, or conflict between faiths, courts became divided between factions loyal to different creeds, each accusing the other of heresy or treason. Monarchs who shifted their policies risked betrayal from courtiers whose consciences or ambitions aligned with opposing sides. A single proclamation could turn yesterday's ally into today's traitor, and betrayals multiplied as nobles maneuvered to preserve their influence under changing tides. Religion became a weapon of betrayal, cloaking ambition in the language of faith, allowing conspirators to justify their treachery as loyalty to God rather than disloyalty to the crown. Even the royal family was not immune from betrayal, for brothers, sisters, uncles, and cousins all carried their own ambitions and claims. A younger brother might betray his elder in pursuit of the crown. A cousin might ally with foreign powers to press a disputed inheritance. A mother might conspire to secure power for her son against rival heirs. Dynasties were riven by internal treachery, as the bonds of blood gave way to the sharper demands of ambition. Betrayal within the family was particularly devastating, for it not only undermined the throne, but shattered the illusion of unity that monarchy depended upon. Civil wars, succession crises, and palace coups often began not with distant enemies, but with betrayal at the heart of the dynasty itself. The atmosphere of constant betrayal bred paranoia among rulers, and paranoia in turn bred further betrayal. Monarchs, uncertain whom to trust, relied increasingly on spies, secret police, and executions to maintain their power. Innocent courtiers were sometimes destroyed simply because the king feared their potential treachery, while true conspirators thrived by hiding behind loyalty until the moment was right to strike. Fear itself became a form of betrayal, corroding the bonds of trust so completely that even genuine devotion was suspect. Kings surrounded themselves with guards, queens retreated into private chambers, and ministers watched one another with suspicion, all aware that at any moment a smile could conceal a knife. Betrayal at court was not always violent or deadly. Sometimes it was slow, a steady erosion of loyalty through disobedience, incompetence, or quiet resistance. A noble might betray the king by neglecting his duties, by withholding taxes, by failing to muster troops when ordered. Ministers might betray their sovereign by enriching themselves at the expense of the crown, siphoning wealth into private coffers. Even flattery could be a form of betrayal, as courtiers exaggerated their devotion while secretly laughing at the monarch's weaknesses. These subtle betrayals were harder to detect, but no less damaging, for they weakened the authority of the crown over time, leaving rulers isolated, impoverished, and vulnerable. The legacy of betrayal within courts was cycles of instability that shaped the destinies of kingdoms. Monarchs rose and fell, not only by the hand of enemies in battle, but by the treachery of those they trusted. Queens were destroyed by rumors, princes murdered by their own kin, ministers executed for disloyalty both real and imagined. The chronicles of every dynasty are filled with tales of betrayal, each one a reminder that thrones were never secure, that crowns sat uneasily upon heads surrounded by rivals eager to snatch them away. The court was at once the heart of monarchy and its greatest threat, a place where loyalty and betrayal danced together in endless and dangerous rhythm. The foreign queen's struggle was one of the most defining, painful, and unrelenting realities of dynastic politics, for she entered her new realm not as a free woman, but as a symbol, as a living treaty, as the embodiment of a bargain struck between two crowns, and in this role her every gesture, every word, every silence was judged, weighed, and often mistrusted. To be a foreign queen was to arrive in a land that was not home, to be surrounded by people who spoke in tongues unfamiliar, who practiced customs alien to her upbringing, who looked upon her not as a mother to their future kings, but as an outsider, an intruder, a reminder that their sovereign had paid for peace, power, or wealth with a bride from beyond their borders. Her struggle began the moment she crossed the frontier, for from that instant she was no longer her father's daughter, but her husband's consort. And yet the blood she carried was never forgotten, ensuring that suspicion would forever cling to her presence. Her arrival was often staged as a grand event, a procession of splendor meant to display unity and joy. But beneath the pageantry, the realities of her struggle already took root. As she dismounted her carriage and entered the palace, whispers followed her, courtiers noting her dress, her demeanor, her accent, questioning whether she would adapt or resist, whether she would place her loyalty with her new subjects, or secretly conspire with her homeland. Every ally she sought was measured against the fear that she might favor those of her own household. The servants and companions she had brought with her, who themselves were treated as spies or parasites draining the wealth of the kingdom. She was meant to be the queen of all, yet from the beginning she was set apart, her identity bound to the foreignness that defined her. The struggle of the foreign queen was not only political but deeply personal. Torn from her family, her language, her homeland, she was thrust into a world where loneliness was constant and trust was scarce. Letters to her kin were often censored or intercepted, her private correspondence scrutinized by ministers who feared treachery in every word. To confide in her attendants was to risk betrayal, for some were loyal, but others were bribed or coerced into reporting her secrets. Even her own household could not be relied upon, for divisions arose among her servants, factions forming that mirrored the rivalries of the court outside. Isolation became her companion, and her struggle lay not only in mastering the ceremonies of queenship, but in preserving a sense of self, when every element of her world pressed her into the mold of her new identity. Motherhood became both her greatest hope and her greatest burden. The birth of an heir could secure her position, silencing whispers and anchoring her firmly in the dynasty, but failure to conceive, or the tragedy of infant mortality, could turn her into the focus of blame and scorn. Her womb was not her own, but the vessel of dynastic survival, her body judged not for beauty or vitality, but for its ability to continue a bloodline. Each pregnancy was watched with anxiety, each miscarriage mourned not for her loss, but for the dynasty's, each daughter dismissed as a disappointment, unless balanced by the birth of a son. In these struggles the queen's identity as a woman was erased, her worth measured only in the currency of heirs, and the court that had once celebrated her arrival could quickly turn against her if she failed to provide what was expected. The struggle deepened when she faced the politics of factionalism. At every court, rival nobles sought to claim her as their ally or to destroy her as their enemy. If she extended favor to one family, others accused her of bias. If she withheld favor, they accused her of coldness. To remain neutral was impossible, for neutrality itself was read as silent allegiance. Her words in council, her gestures at banquets, even the seating arrangements at her feasts became battlegrounds upon which the nobility measured her loyalties. In such an atmosphere, every decision she made risked betrayal or retaliation, and the queen lived in the constant struggle of choosing carefully whom to trust. Knowing that every friendship might one day be the instrument of her downfall, religion was often a source of agony in her struggle. Many foreign queens crossed borders not only of geography, but of faith, leaving behind the religious practices of their childhood to adopt those demanded by their new kingdom. A Catholic queen married into a Protestant court, or a Protestant queen wedded to a Catholic king, found herself a lightning rod for suspicion. Accused of secretly practicing her old religion, of conspiring with clerics from her homeland, of plotting to convert the king or the heirs. Every prayer, every visit to chapel, every confession became a subject of scrutiny, and her piety was not her own, but a stage upon which her loyalty was tested. Even when she conformed outwardly, her sincerity was questioned, for suspicion clung to her like a shadow, and in this matter no performance could truly erase the doubts of her subjects. The struggle also extended to her marriage itself, for the union was rarely built upon affection. Her husband, the king, might see her as nothing more than the symbol of an alliance, a duty fulfilled, a partner in name but not in heart. Many foreign queens found themselves neglected in favor of mistresses, their position at court undermined by rivals who shared the king's affection. To be ignored was dangerous, for without the king's support the queen had little defense against her enemies, yet to protest his neglect was also perilous, for queens who challenged the authority of their husbands were accused of arrogance or rebellion. In such circumstances, her struggle became one of survival, maintaining dignity while enduring humiliation, fighting for influence in a marriage that was never her choice. The court ladies assigned to serve her could be as much a source of torment as of comfort. Some were loyal companions, but others were spies, tools of rival factions, or ambitious women seeking their own advancement at the queen's expense. They watched her every movement, reported her private words, and sometimes betrayed her secrets to the king or his ministers. In this environment, even her most intimate circle became a battlefield of intrigue. where loyalty could not be assumed and betrayal was always a possibility. The queen's struggle was therefore not only against the nobles of the court, but against the very walls of her own household, which echoed with divided loyalties and hidden agendas. Public perception added another layer of hardship. The common people, who often never saw her closely, judged her through rumors, pamphlets, and propaganda spread by her enemies. She might be depicted as a foreign temptress, a scheming spy, a cold-hearted tyrant, or a cursed woman bringing misfortune upon the land. Her accent, her manner of dress, her customs were mocked as alien, and in times of crisis, famine, plague, or war, blame was often laid upon her shoulders. She became a convenient scapegoat, for she was both visible and vulnerable, unable to defend herself against the tide of public suspicion. Her struggle was therefore waged not only in the palace, but in the streets, where her reputation could be ruined by whispers she never heard and accusations she could never answer. The queen's struggle was also a matter of legacy. She knew that history would judge her not as a woman, but as a queen, and her actions would be remembered not for their humanity, but for their political consequences. To navigate this world demanded constant vigilance, the ability to endure humiliation without breaking, to act with dignity in the face of suspicion, to fight for survival in a court that often wished for her failure. She bore the burden of representing her homeland, of preserving her husband's dynasty, of mothering heirs, and of maintaining alliances, all while being denied the freedom to live as an individual. Her struggle was therefore not merely a personal ordeal, but the very condition of queenship itself, the inevitable fate of any woman whose life was transformed into a symbol of power in the end. The foreign queen's struggle was not a story of triumph or defeat, but of endurance, of living day after day under scrutiny and suspicion, of sacrificing personal happiness for dynastic necessity, of surviving betrayal, loneliness, and hostility while maintaining the facade of majesty required by her position. She was never simply a wife or a mother, never simply a woman in love or in sorrow, but always the queen, the foreign queen, the one whose very presence was both necessary and resented, cherished and distrusted, honored and hated, and her struggle lay in the impossibility of reconciling these contradictions, in the endless effort to exist in a world where her body, her blood, her faith, and her loyalty were all claimed by others, while her heart remained forever her own. A king's deadly bargain was never struck in haste, for every ruler knew that promises written in blood, sealed with marriage, and bound with oaths carried a weight that could not easily be cast aside. Yet history shows again and again that kings were compelled by desperation, ambition, or necessity to enter into agreements that brought ruin upon themselves, their thrones, and their people. The bargain could take many forms: a treaty signed under duress, a marriage arranged to avert war, a ransom agreed to save a crown. But at its heart it was always the same, the exchange of something precious, often irreplaceable, for the fleeting promise of security or the illusion of peace. When a king made such a bargain, he bound not only himself, but generations to come, for these agreements extended beyond the span of a single life and reshaped the destinies of kingdoms long after the hand that signed them had turned to dust. The need to strike such bargains often arose when a king found himself cornered by circumstances he could not master with force alone. War drained treasuries, rebellions bled armies dry, famine eroded the loyalty of subjects, and rival claimants pressed their advantage with merciless calculation. In such moments, a king who could not win with the sword turned to the pen, offering concessions that no proud ruler would make unless driven to desperation. Lands were ceded, revenues promised, titles granted, and marriages arranged not from strength, but from weakness. The bargain was deadly because it mortgaged the future to pay for the present, because it traded away the independence of the crown in order to secure its immediate survival, and because once given such concessions could rarely be taken back without renewed bloodshed. Marriage was perhaps the deadliest of all bargains a king could strike, for in marrying his daughter or sister to a rival power, he placed not only her life, but the succession of his dynasty in the hands of others. A foreign queen brought with her the potential to unite two crowns, but she also brought the risk that her children would inherit conflicting claims, sparking wars of succession that consumed nations. Kings agreed to such unions believing they would secure peace. Yet history shows that they often sowed the seeds of greater conflict. The 100 Years' War was rooted in such a bargain, when the marriage alliances between English and French dynasties created overlapping claims to the French throne. What began as a diplomatic arrangement ended as one of the longest and bloodiest wars in medieval Europe. Proof that bargains struck to prevent war could just as easily guarantee it. At times the bargain was financial, a desperate attempt to fill an empty treasury. Kings pawned their jewels, borrowed from wealthy merchants, and pledged future revenues in order to pay for wars or to buy loyalty from their nobles. But the greatest collateral was always land, and many rulers signed away towns, castles, and provinces as security for loans they could never repay. These bargains were deadly, because once a realm was mortgaged, it was rarely recovered without force, and the people of those lands found themselves torn between competing lords, paying the price for their king's desperation. A ruler who signed away the patrimony of his ancestors might save his throne for a season, but he doomed his dynasty to generations of conflict as future heirs struggled to reclaim what had been lost. Hostages were another form of deadly bargain, and kings were often forced to surrender their own children as living pledges of their loyalty to a treaty. Princes and princesses were sent into the custody of rival courts, raised in foreign lands under the watchful eyes of those who would gladly exploit them as leverage. For the king who signed such a bargain, the cost was unbearable, for failure to uphold the treaty could mean the death or imprisonment of his own blood. Yet many had no choice, for the alternative was ruin. These hostages became pawns in the larger game of kingship, their lives reduced to guarantees of paper promises, and their fates were often tragic, for if war broke out anew they could be executed in vengeance, their deaths serving as grim reminders that bargains made by kings were paid for in the blood of innocents. Even when a king entered into a bargain with full knowledge of its risks, the weight of necessity often left him blind to the consequences. A treaty might preserve the peace for his lifetime, but it created obligations his heirs could not meet, binding future generations to humiliating tribute or impossible alliances. Rulers who thought they had bought stability discovered too late that they had purchased only delay, and their successors inherited the debts, the rivalries, and the bitterness that such bargains always produced. In this sense, the bargain was deadly not because it killed the king who made it, but because it condemned those who followed him to wars and struggles far worse than the ones he sought to avoid. Some bargains were struck not with foreign powers, but within the king's own court. For monarchs often relied upon their nobles to provide troops and funds, and when rebellion loomed they were forced to grant concessions that weakened their own authority. Charters were signed, privileges extended, and limits placed upon the royal prerogative in order to buy peace with discontented lords. The Magna Carta itself was one such bargain, wrung from King John of England by his barons at sword point. Though it saved his throne in the moment, it set in motion a process that forever altered the balance of power between monarch and nobility. For rulers like John, the bargain was deadly because it curtailed the very foundation of their authority, turning the crown from an absolute force into one that could be checked and challenged by those who had once been subjects. Religion added another layer of peril to the bargains of kings. When monarchs sought the support of the church, they often granted privileges to bishops, abbots, and even the papacy itself, promises that enriched the clergy but impoverished the crown. A king who sought papal favour might pledge lands or revenues to monasteries, weakening his realm for the sake of spiritual legitimacy. Others struck bargains with rival religious factions within their own kingdoms, tolerating heresies or suppressing freedoms in order to maintain fragile peace. These bargains were deadly because they entangled the crown in conflicts of conscience, binding it to causes that divided the realm, and ensuring that every decision thereafter would be judged not only politically but spiritually. The most insidious bargains were those struck in secret, agreements whispered in chambers, written in hidden clauses, or sealed with oaths known only to a few. Such bargains often came to light only when it was too late, when the betrayal was revealed, when the king's promises were exposed, and the realm discovered that its ruler had bound it to obligations it could not honour. secret clauses in marriage treaties, promises of succession, secret alliances with rival powers, all created webs of treachery that ensnared not only the monarch, but the people he ruled. These bargains were deadly because they undermined trust itself, leaving subjects uncertain whether their king served their interests or his own survival. The foreign queen often found herself entangled in these bargains, for she was both a participant and a victim of the deals her husband struck. Married off as part of a treaty, she was expected to endure exile, suspicion, and hostility in order to secure a peace she had no voice in shaping. If the bargain failed, she bore the blame, accused of treachery or of bringing misfortune upon the realm. Her children, too, were part of the price, their futures dictated by agreements made before they were even born, their lives mortgaged to treaties that saw them betrothed or surrendered as hostages. For her, the king's deadly bargain was not an abstract policy, but a lived reality, shaping every aspect of her existence and binding her fate to decisions made in council chambers far from her control. The imagery of blood often accompanied such bargains, for they were not simply transactions of land or coin, but of life itself. Wars ended with rivers of blood, and treaties were signed to stop the flow, yet in binding themselves to peace kings, often ensured that more blood would be spilled in the future. The phrase "a price of blood" was not metaphorical but literal, for the bargains of rulers were paid for in the lives of soldiers, nobles, and commoners alike, whose fates were determined not by their own choices, but by the desperate signatures of kings. A ruler might preserve his throne, but the cost was borne by the bodies of those who marched to defend or reclaim what he had surrendered. History is filled with examples of such bargains. King Richard the Lionheart was forced to mortgage his kingdom to pay his ransom after being captured on his return from crusade, a bargain that drained England and burdened his subjects with crushing taxes. King Henry VI of England married Margaret of Anjou as part of a peace treaty with France, a bargain that gave away territories and sowed the seeds of the Wars of the Roses. Charles V of Spain struck bargains with the German princes to maintain his empire, concessions that weakened imperial unity and allowed the Reformation to spread unchecked. Each of these kings believed the bargain was necessary, yet each discovered that the price they paid was greater than the reward they gained. The deadly bargain was therefore the constant companion of kingship, for no ruler could reign without compromise, and every compromise carried with it the potential for ruin. Thrones were preserved, dynasties prolonged, wars postponed, but always at a cost measured not only in lands and treasures, but in the very lives of those who depended upon the crown. The bargain was deadly because it demanded sacrifice, and in the world of kings, sacrifice was never abstract, but always human, always flesh, always blood. The legacy written in blood was not merely a phrase, but the reality of monarchy. For every decision made by a king or queen, every alliance formed, every war declared, every marriage arranged, carried consequences that spilled over into the lives of countless others, and in the long span of history, it was rarely parchment or stone that preserved a ruler's memory, but the crimson mark of violence, the shadow of betrayal, the grief of families torn apart. To rule was to accept that one's name would be remembered not for peace but for conflict, not for harmony but for division, not for gentleness but for the cruelty that survival demanded, and thus the very concept of legacy in dynastic politics was entwined with sacrifice, with execution, with battlefields littered by the dead. A king's lineage might survive, a queen's children might ascend to the throne, a dynasty might endure for centuries, but each stage of that endurance was bought with the lifeblood of subjects, whose fates were decided by forces they could neither influence nor escape. The legacy of rulers was written in the blood of succession, for every crown passed from one head to another only after struggle. Rare was the peaceful transfer of power, rarer still the unchallenged inheritance. Brothers slew brothers, uncles murdered nephews, cousins turned armies against one another, and mothers plotted against sons to secure the future of their chosen heirs. The smooth farce, aid of coronations and ceremonies masked the brutal reality that behind the crown lay rivers of blood, spilled to defend or contest the right to wear it. Dynasties prided themselves on the continuity of their line, but such continuity was forged not by gentle inheritance, but by the ruthless elimination of rivals, and every genealogy, carefully recorded in illuminated manuscripts, was underwritten by the silenced voices of those cut down, so that one branch of the family might prevail. The foreign queen herself was bound within this legacy, for her marriage was intended to strengthen bloodlines, to merge claims, to extend dynasties across borders, but in doing so she often unleashed fresh cycles of conflict. Her children might inherit 2 crowns, yet in so doing they invited 2 realms to quarrel over them. The queen's womb became the battlefield, where dynastic claims were fused, and her offspring bore the burden of disputes that could last generations. The legacy she left was therefore never hers alone, but one stained with the blood of soldiers who fought in wars that her marriage had set in motion. She might never wield a sword, but her presence in the royal line ensured that rivers of blood flowed in her name. The legacy written in blood was also preserved in rebellions crushed by force. Kings who demanded loyalty and obedience often faced uprisings from their own nobles, their subjects, or their vassals, and the suppression of these rebellions left scars that endured for centuries. Executions, mass punishments, confiscations of land, and the brutal destruction of towns all became part of the memory of a reign. A monarch might believe that stamping out rebellion secured peace, but what it secured was resentment, and resentment itself was a kind of blood memory passed from one generation to the next, ensuring that the ruler's name was remembered not with reverence but with bitterness. The gallows and the battlefield alike became monuments to this legacy, silent reminders that kingship was purchased at the cost of lives that would never be restored. Dynasties prided themselves on their genealogies, on tracing their descent from ancient heroes or even from divine figures. But these stories of glory could not obscure the bloodshed that made them possible. A legacy of majesty was always shadowed by a legacy of violence, for the throne was never won by kindness but by conquest, never secured by mercy but by calculation. Every noble house, every royal family, had its foundation in blood, in the dispossession of others, in the forced marriages, in the betrayals and executions that carved away rivals until only one line remained. The monuments of kings, the castles, the cathedrals, the tombs of marble and gold were built with wealth extracted from subjects and defended by armies whose lives were spent in endless campaigns. The stones themselves seemed to bleed, for their construction was a silent testament to the countless lives consumed by the ambitions of those who claimed divine right to rule. Religion, too, became a stage upon which legacies of blood were written. Rulers defended their faith with fire and sword, suppressing heresies, expelling minorities, launching crusades, or imposing conversions upon unwilling subjects. In such acts they believed they secured the salvation of their souls and the stability of their kingdoms, yet the cost was measured in blood, in massacres, in forced migrations, in wars fought in the name of heaven but decided on earth. The chronicles recorded these deeds as triumphs of the true faith, but for those who suffered under them the memory was one of agony. Thus the legacy of a pious king was not only the building of churches or the patronage of monks, but the silent graves of those whose lives were extinguished for the sake of orthodoxy. And once again it was in blood that his name was preserved. The symbolism of blood itself carried weight in the rituals of monarchy, for coronations often included anointings with holy oil, ceremonies that cloaked violence in sanctity. Yet beneath the pageantry was the unspoken truth that crowns were forged in blood and guarded by blood. Oaths of loyalty were sworn upon relics, marriages celebrated with feasts, treaties signed with pen and seal, but always it was the sword that enforced them, and the sword always drew blood. Monarchs surrounded themselves with heraldry, with mottos and banners proclaiming honor and legitimacy, but the reality behind these symbols was the brutal necessity of violence. Their legacies were thus written not only in the ink of charters, but in the red stain of lives taken to uphold them, even in death. Rulers could not escape the legacy of blood. Their funerals might be lavish, their tombs magnificent, but the memory that endured was often one of conflict. A king who had waged wars left behind not peace, but debts and vendettas. A queen who had secured alliances through her children left behind not unity, but rival claims. The legacies that filled chronicles and annals were therefore not gentle but violent, reminding all who read them that the story of monarchy was the story of sacrifice. Generations later, Poets and historians might embellish the deeds of rulers, turning them into heroes or villains, but the foundation of these stories was always the same: the undeniable truth that their reigns were secured and defined by the blood of others. The legacy written in blood extended beyond borders, for dynastic politics rarely respected the confines of a single realm. A marriage that bound two crowns together often unleashed wars that engulfed entire regions. The rivalry between Spain and France, the conflicts between England and Scotland, the struggles of the Holy Roman Empire, all were fueled by bargains and marriages that promised unity but delivered violence. Thus the legacy of one ruler's choice rippled outward, staining lands far beyond their own kingdom. Villages burned, fields were ruined, trade routes collapsed, and entire generations grew up in the shadow of wars born of decisions made in distant palaces. The blood of subjects across Europe, Asia, and beyond bore witness to the legacies of rulers who sought to expand their dynasties, proving that monarchy's reach extended not only across space, but across the bodies of those sacrificed to sustain it. It was not only the noble or the powerful who shaped these legacies, but also the ordinary subjects, for their lives and deaths provided the material from which history was woven. Peasants conscripted into armies, townsfolk taxed to exhaustion, farmers forced to surrender their harvests, artisans compelled to build fortifications, all contributed their labor and their blood to the maintenance of royal power. Their names were rarely recorded, their stories seldom told, yet without them the crown could not have endured. Their deaths on battlefields, their suffering in famine, their silence under oppression, all became part of the hidden legacy of monarchy, the unspoken blood history that underpinned the grandeur of courts and the magnificence of kings. Thus the legacy written in blood was not only that of rulers, but of the countless nameless who bore the cost of their ambitions. Dynastic memory itself was curated to obscure the extent of this blood legacy. Chronicles emphasized victories, celebrated alliances, and glorified rulers, but beneath the polished narratives the reality was far darker. Every triumph was purchased at a cost, every alliance sealed with sacrifice, every coronation dependent on the deaths of rivals. The legacy of kings and queens was therefore a carefully constructed illusion, a narrative crafted to inspire loyalty and awe, but one that could never fully erase the truth of the blood upon which it rested. Even when chroniclers sought to soften the image of a ruler, the whispers of violence endured, for subjects remembered, and memory itself became another kind of blood, flowing through generations in stories of betrayal, oppression, and resistance. Bloodlines themselves were the very language of legacy, for dynasties traced their power through genealogies, proclaiming descent as the source of legitimacy. Yet these bloodlines were never pure, never peaceful, never uncontested. They were forged through marriages that were bargains, through assassinations that removed rivals, through battles that eliminated claimants. To speak of a noble bloodline was to speak of a history of violence, and the continuity of a dynasty was nothing more than the survival of one branch at the expense of all others. Thus even the very concept of heritage, so prized by monarchs, was inseparable from the blood that had been spilled to preserve it. The foreign queen, the king, the heirs, the nobles, the clergy, the people, all were caught within this cycle. None could escape it, for the system itself was built upon the inevitability of blood. To rule was to take, to preserve was to destroy, to survive was to sacrifice others. This was the paradox of monarchy, that its grandeur was inseparable from its brutality, that its beauty was inseparable from its cruelty, that its legacy was inseparable from its blood.